This is the story of a small town girl who claims she was in the wrong place at the wrong time and was sentenced to 165 years in prison for a crime that she didn't commit. Or did she? Some people argue that she's a criminal, some say she was a victim, some say she was a bystander, and some say she's all three. Confused? So was the jury. This crime occurred in the early morning of September 14th, 2000. Philip Stroud, Ronald Carter, Correll Seabrooks, and Tyrone Wade all leave from a house in South Bend, Indiana, and drive 12 miles to a home in another city called Lakeville. The home they drove to was owned by a man named Art Sears. Everything to know about Sears' crib was that it was this huge, sprawling home on a large chunk of property. It was clear the Sears family was rolling in dough. The guys are driving up and their plan is to rob the place. They know that no one is home and they had a general idea of when the family left for work and would return. So, as they're pulling up, these three construction workers start walking out of the barn garage hybrid. Obviously, the men weren't counting on anyone being home that day, so they started to panic. These three construction workers walking up saying, "Hey guys, need any help with anything?" And thinking quickly, the men were like, "Oh, we're coming to look at a car for sale. We'll be back later when the family's home." At that point, the construction workers were like, "Sounds Gucci," and they headed back to work. So, as the four men went to leave, Philip, who is kind of the leader of the group, stops and is like, hold on. He realized that the construction workers had seen them, their cars, and possibly even their license plates. So now, the conversation in the car quickly turns into an argument about whether the workers should be allowed to live or not. Yikes. The four men go back to the property, head into the barn, and make the construction workers get on the ground, where Correll begins to tie them up. Ronald tells the workers that they have nothing to be worried about, but Philip immediately tells them to shut up. As soon as Correll is finished tying up the third worker, he hears Philip open fire. In a matter of seconds, Philip had taken out all three workers. Then the four dudes steal the construction workers' wallets, burglarize the Sears' home, and leave the property. By now, I'm sure you're wondering, who are these men? Why did they target this specific home? And how did they know enough about this property to break in? 2 words. Charity Payne. Charity Payne was this 18-year-old small-town girl living in a lonely world. She grew up in Indiana, and her friends described her as a sweet, outgoing girl who is trusting of anyone almost to a fault. I won't focus on it too much, but it is important to know that Charity dealt with some sort of trauma or incident in her childhood that affected her a lot growing up. Her mother mentioned in an interview that she was best friends with her daughter. They apparently told each other everything. But one day, something happened because Charity stopped talking. Friends often describe Charity as a girl who accidentally put herself in risky situations because of her naivete in trusting people, and that sometimes she could miss certain indicators that someone was not trustworthy. Psychologists say that a lot of victims of childhood trauma can sometimes have trouble creating boundaries and engage in dangerous behaviors, which will begin to make a lot more sense later in Charity's story. When senior year rolled around, Charity's friends said she kind of stopped hanging out with them and started hanging out with people who they weren't comfortable with. South Bend, Indiana was a bit of a poorer neighborhood than the middle-class neighborhood of North Liberty, where Charity grew up. Charity started hanging out with people from there. Her friends weren't really into it, so they kind of stopped kicking it with her. So how did she get all wrapped up with these guys? According to Charity, here's what happened. On September 13th, Charity borrowed a car from her friend and was on her way to a work orientation. She got confused and suddenly found herself in a neighborhood she'd never been in before, in South Bend. This neighborhood just so happened to be a frequent hangout spot for Philip and his 3 accomplices. Charity drove right past the 4 men when Correll saw her and started yelling at her to stop. Philip jumped out in front of her car just to make sure she did. Philip had Charity roll down her window. The two start shooting the shit and whatnot and start talking about friends they had in common. Because remember, Charity was a little too trusting of everyone. Charity mentioned that she used to date this guy named John Sears, and John actually knew Philip's cousin. Then they casually started talking about the wealth of the Sears family. Charity mentioned how amazing the house and their pool was and spilled tea on when it was vacant. Yeah, it's so great. This big house is definitely full of expensive valuables and like empty a lot of the time. In fact, from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., I'd say it's anyone's free game. Also, what did you guys say your names were again? Oh, sweet Charity. So then, Charity said that Philip made it known that he was armed. He apparently threatened Charity into driving to pick up his friend, Tyrone, and then told her she had to take them by the Sears residence. So at this point, Charity said she was scared and knew Philip had a weapon, so she decided to do everything he told her. Is this story starting to sound fishy? Yeah. even at face value, Charity's story doesn't really make sense. But just remember, there are two sides to every story. When you hear the police's side, I think you'll get a better idea of what went down. So Charity and the boys all drove past the residence and then went back to the house in South Bend. This time, they all went inside. A guy named Curtis was in the house at the time and testified that Philip and Charity went into the bathroom and talked for a bit. After Charity left, Philip told Curtis that Charity had a lick. Apparently, lick is a slang term for burglary prospect. In case it's been a while since you burglarized someone and you need to refresh your terminology. So Charity went back to her friend's house, whom she had borrowed the car from. And when she does, she's like, I need to talk to you. The friend says she seemed a bit shaken up and scared, and they never got to talking about whatever it was that Charity needed to say. Which, like, I love a good tea spilling sesh, so if someone ever says they need to talk, I'm like, let's go. But I don't know how she just dropped a hot potato like that without ever getting into it. And the very next day, Philip executed the 3 construction workers. Being in a small town, this was obviously a big deal. Stuff like that just doesn't happen. So, when the news broke, everyone just lost their minds. At first, no one really knew what to make of this seemingly random crime. No one even knew the 3 would be working that day, and the cops were absolutely stumped. And then they got a phone call. The caller was Charity's boss, who said that when Charity heard about the 3 bodies discovered at the Sears place, she immediately broke down sobbing and said she was responsible. The police immediately take Charity in for questioning, and they question her for over 12 hours. Slowly but surely, she started to confess more and more incriminating information until her story evolved quite a bit. Charity eventually confessed that she had actually met some of the men before, unlike her previous statement when she had ran into them at South Bend. She claimed she was at the mall with her friend when she ran into Philip, Corral, and 2 of their other friends, and they got to talking. Then she randomly ran into Philip and Corral again the next day and gets lost. And the day after that is when the robbery gone wrong occurred. Charity also said that she gave Corral her and her friend's number at the mall because she really wanted to hang out with them. After the police investigated more, they theorized that although Charity was indeed scheduled to be at work orientation, they said that all the signs indicated that she intended to meet up with the men to buy some Mary Jane, or the devil's lettuce, if you will. But Charity denied the statement. She said she wasn't seeking any substances and claimed the police had no evidence to support their theory. Also, remember how Charity said her and Philip talked about how they had all these mutual friends like John Sears? Well, apparently that wasn't true. The cops questioned Philip and the 3 other men, and all of them said they didn't know the Sears family at all. Like, they had never met them before and had no relation to them whatsoever. Philip also told detectives that Charity was the one who brought up the idea of the burglary all on her own. And remember, John is this girl's ex-boyfriend, so there was a pretty solid motive for her to go after him. So Charity told the cops that she supplied the 4 men with the maid schedule, the family's routine, the layout of the house, and instructions on how to bypass the home's alarm system. She also said she passed along the Sears' unlisted phone number to the robbers. At some points during the questioning, she called herself an accomplice, but she was mainly referring to the burglary portion of the crime. When the cops finally had enough incriminating evidence against Charity and the 4 other men, they arrested them all. Charity ended up waiting in jail for 2 years until she's finally put on trial. Now this is where shit gets real. Because of the nature of the crime and it being a small town and all, this story was everywhere. People were absolutely furious about the case and they really wanted to see justice served. But there was a big divide in opinions. Those who sided with Charity and believed she was not responsible for the construction workers' lives said that the fact that they tried Charity first instead of the men meant that everyone went harder on her. Also, she apparently didn't make the best first impression in the courtroom. Because the first day in court, Charity showed up with her blonde hair and cornrows, and there was a visible reaction from her defense team. Like, first of all, sweet girl, come on, cornrows. Have we not all learned a lesson on cultural appropriation? And also, people always say you want to show up to court like you are dressed for church. So the fact that this sweet-looking girl rolls up looking completely different and almost like she's trying to play a part of this criminal accomplice is a big old bucket of yikes for her defense team. Especially because her defense team's entire strategy was that she was this sweet, wholesome, innocent girl who was just too trusting of everyone and was taken advantage by some young black men from South Bend who were real criminals. Her team tried to portray her as this naive girl who let slip to these robbers that she has a really wealthy ex-boyfriend. Casual. The prosecutors argued that an accessory or accomplice does not actually have to be present at the scene for them to be responsible for the crime. If you remember, Charles Manson never actually committed any executions himself. It was his beloved brainwashed bandits that carried out the crimes for him, but he was still the one responsible. The prosecutors also argued that Charity was the ringleader of the entire operation, and even though she didn't fire the shots, she called the shots. So the jury deliberated for 5.5 hours before reaching the verdict of guilty. Charity was found guilty on all 3 accounts and was sentenced to 165 years in prison at the age of 21. As for the 4 men, Wade was sentenced to 275 years, Carell was sentenced to 180, and Ronald got 45 years. Philip, the trigger man, was at first going to get the ultimate penalty, but his sentence was later changed to life in prison without possibility of parole. Obviously, people were again split on the outcome of whether or not Charity deserved her sentence, but it sounded like for the most part, people agreed that because Charity planned the robbery, she was subsequently responsible for the lost lives. But then, one day when she was 7 years into her 165-year sentence, Charity was notified that she was going to be released from prison. Wait. NANI? That's right. Her sentence was reversed due to an appeal made regarding a law that was passed after she was sentenced. She also wasn't properly read her Miranda rights before the investigation. So the new law that I mentioned basically said that any interrogation that lasted longer than 11 hours was seen as coercive. And since they held Charity for a little over 12 hours, never properly read her Miranda rights, along with a few other legal mistakes and technicalities that were made in the courtroom, Charity was free to go. Mamma mia, now that's a spicy meatball. Can you even imagine? You've been in prison since you were 18. At 21, you're looking at spending the rest of your life in jail. So you just try to get through each slowly passing hour, and then one day, after 7 years of this fate, you're taken to a courtroom and told that you get to go home with your mom that night. And so she did. That's right. Charity, to this day, is still a free woman. She says life hasn't been easy for her. Obviously, the felony is still on her record, so it's been really hard to find a job to support herself. Charity also says everyone in town knows who she is, and anytime she goes somewhere in public, she's surrounded by people who hate her guts. Apparently, she got hired as a server at a local restaurant, and the place immediately started getting 1-star reviews on Yelp, degrading comments about them hiring a criminal. So yeah, that's gotta be tough. But then, why wouldn't she move, or dye her hair, or change her name? Obviously, I still don't really know how I feel about this case. Hearing that a 21-year-old was sentenced to 165 years in jail is definitely unusual, but it's even more unusual for anyone to be released from a sentence that long, at least without some sort of extraordinary circumstances. So, what do you think? Was Charity responsible for the crime, or was it a classic case of wrong place at the wrong time? Honestly, it's kind of impossible to know. Sorry. No more lasagna puns. It's getting a bit too cheesy. Stay safe out there.